So I've got a couple of questions for you to start out with. So we've heard about sleep and its impact, and I'm going to take you specifically down the pathway of safety and sleep and the challenges that occur in road safety but apply to other areas as well. I'm just anyone in the room who's ever been driving along and had that feeling that your head sort of, and if you don't put your hand up, you're probably lying, I can tell you. Good. So most of the audience have experienced that. What about maybe something a little simpler where you're driving along and go, oh, just can't, find it a bit hard to keep my eyes open, they're feeling a bit heavy. Most people experience that, pretty much everyone. I'm not going to say good, but at least you're telling me the truth, which is a good start. So if you've had one of those head nodding experiences, you have had a microsleep while you're driving. We know that if you look at that in the laboratory, your brain waves will have started to slow down, approaching sleep, not going into a really deep sleep, but they will certainly have slowed down. And it's only kind of by chance, really, that you haven't had an accident at that time. If you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, something was coming in front of you, or you're on the bend in the road, then there's a good chance that you would have had a crash at the time that that episode occurred. I've got a second question for you. Who, after they had that episode, stopped driving? Okay, so maybe 2 or 3 people out of most of the room who actually stopped. That's also a normal response. Most people go, oh, head nearly hit the steering wheel. I'm wide awake now. I'm okay, I'll keep going. Can I just say that's a bad decision because it will come back and it will happen again. I've got a few slides, so I'm putting up some information from an Australian study published recently that put out a large survey asking about people's experience of drowsy driving, and about 30% of people who responded said that they'd had episodes of drowsy driving in the last year, and about 5% of those had had a fall asleep accident in the last year. So this is a very common problem. If you think back to those episodes, what I want you to think about is what was happening at the time. You know, were you driving late at night? Maybe you'd had a poor night's sleep the night beforehand. Perhaps you're on a really long trip where you're driving for a prolonged period. And these are the sorts of circumstances that might lead the brain to switching off for short periods and impairing brain function and putting you at risk. We know, for example, that for drowsy driving or sleep-related crashes in this circumstance, that nighttime driving is a particularly high-risk time. And that's because your body clock or your body rhythm at nighttime is telling the brain to switch off. So your brain waves are slowing down, and as they slow down, that impairs various functions, which I'm going to speak to a bit more, but it means your reaction times are slower, you're more likely to have microsleeps, and it's particularly between that period after midnight, between about 2 o'clock and 6 a.m, when that's particularly prominent. What also often happens though is that people have got up in the morning, they've stayed awake all day, and then they're driving at night time. So it's not just the effects of that body clock on being impaired, but they've been awake for a very prolonged period. So that's a particularly bad decision to get up first thing in the morning and then stay awake all day and then drive at night time, because you're combining 2 major problems there, being awake for a prolonged period and the effects of the body clock, both of which are telling your brain to switch off and get recovery. And that results, when you look at this crash risk, is that right at the end of the night, around 6, 7, 8 o'clock, it's those people who have been awake almost for 24 hours and their body clock still hasn't woken up yet. And they've got these 2 terrible factors competing together that result in a particularly high crash risk at that time. So that's really something to avoid, like the plague. So what other things, what other circumstances might put you at particularly high risk? Now, we all know about alcohol. I hate to say it, my dad, who's about 85, 86, my kid's starting to learn to drive in the last 5 to 10 years, and we'd go out for lunch with him, and he would say to my daughter, oh, come on, you can have a glass of wine, it's all right. And And he said, when I was a kid, I used to go to the pub and we'd, drink a whole lot of wine, beer and go home. There were no problems. I go, Dad, please don't do that. So 30, 40, 50 years later, we've changed our minds about alcohol. Most people would not do that now, although it's still stuck in my father's brain that it's okay. My daughter, fortunately, sensibly goes, no way, I am not going to do that. But we're not in the same way for sleep. We still think that it's okay to drive late at night. It's okay to drive when you haven't had enough sleep. But these things put you at the same risk as you do from having a lot of alcohol. So alcohol at around 0.05 to 0.08% increases your risk of crashes by about 2 to 3-fold. And that nighttime driving I talked about pushes your crash risk up beyond that. It's about 5-fold increase in risk if you drive at night. So worse than what you would get from illegal alcohol levels. Not enough sleep, just for one night, not enough sleep also will do the same thing. So less than 5 hours of sleep, which is pretty common, will put your crash risk up by about 3-fold. And if you go down under 4 hours of sleep, that starts to increase exponentially. It goes up to about 14 times increase in crash risk if you've had less than 4 hours of sleep. So if you've got kids like mine are drilled in this, my 2 teenage/young adults, they've heard enough of it. But if you've got kids or grandkids and they're learning to drive, we should be teaching them this stuff. And at the moment, we don't do that very regularly. Most of our training authorities for licensing don't include this type of information in what we talk to them about. So we should be drilling them more. Sleep apnea, which is the most common of the sleep disorders, also puts your crash risk up into the same territory. So at least 2-fold, but probably a bit higher if you have sleep apnea that is not treated. And obviously that's often under-recognised. Okay. Now, these problems with sleep can be exacerbated by other things that are very common. So what do the young adult children that I'm talking about do on a Saturday night? Well, they get up in the morning, they go and play a bit of basketball, then they go to a party at night, and then they want to drive home at 2 or 3 in the morning. That's the sleep part. And then there may not have been a bit of alcohol involved, or maybe some other drugs. And these factors exacerbate the problem further. So you combine impaired sleep with drugs or alcohol, and you're going to multiply that risk dramatically. There are other common drugs, some antidepressants, sleeping medications that will also increase this. So you can take a sleeping tablet at night time that may still be having an effect on slowing the brainwaves down the following morning. Okay. And just to give you an example of this effect, this is when we advertised for this study, it was quite interesting. It was, come and we want you to stay up late and drink alcohol in the middle of the night was the subject of the study. And if you have a look on the left-hand side, we've got people's driving performance. This is variation in speed on a driving simulator when they haven't had any alcohol, and then at an alcohol level at 0.03, not much change, and then 0.05, and there's about a 2 or 3 increase in the risk and their variation in speed and how well they keep to the middle of the lane while driving. But then if you do this at 1 or 3 o'clock in the morning, you can see the dramatic effect that this has. So you have no alcohol at 1 o'clock in the morning, you've got about a doubling because of the sleep effects, but you put a little bit of alcohol on top of that and you about 3 or 4 times increase in the impairment in your driving capacity. So really critical that we avoid these combinations. I'm just showing you a similar thing. This is for sleep apnea, where similarly if you restrict sleep and you've got sleep apnea, it's a pretty bad combination. You dramatically increase the risk that you're going to have a crash when you look at driving simulation if you put those 2 things together. So if you know you've got a sleep disorder, it's really important that you follow these other rules as well. Not only treat your sleep disorder, but you avoid things like drugs and alcohol, which might exacerbate it. Make sure you get enough sleep. You avoid driving in the middle of the night if you have those problems. Okay, so how do we know that any one person is particularly at risk? Well, we tend to ask questions about what people are normally like. So think for yourself, do you ever have episodes when you might doze off in front of the television, or you might doze off working on the computer or at the movies? Probably a few head nodding in there. Maybe somebody who dozes off at the traffic lights occasionally when the car is stopped. That's obviously getting a bit more serious, but that happens. Through to people who recognise that they're dozing off at times during their normal driving, or perhaps they get so sleepy that they have to stop driving. They go, I'm worried about it now, I'm going to stop and pull over. All of those things in varying degrees are indications of somebody having a chronic degree of sleepiness or tiredness. And the more active the situation that you're in, where you tend to doze, usually means that you have a greater degree of chronic sleepiness. So obviously the person at the traffic lights is a bit more of a worry than the person who dozes off just in front of the television. But what we know is if you look at those things and you can add them up, you can identify people who have a higher risk of crashes. And this is a particular scale that we use. On the very high sleepiness scale end of it, they get a 2 to 3-fold increased risk of having a crash and of multiple crashes. So we use that clinically to try and help work out if an individual person might be at risk in the long term of having fall asleep crashes. Might skip that one. Now, come back and I asked you at the start about whether you'd noticed the head nodding episodes, difficulty keeping your eyes open, and these things are actually good indicators of whether you might have a problem right now. So how does somebody who's driving along make a decision that I'm becoming too impaired to drive? And I think, gee, maybe I better pull over and do something about this. It's something we know we don't do very well. So the head nodding, you've already had a microsleep, that is too late. Well, it's not too late if you survive it. If you survive it, you then should make a decision to pull over and do something about it. But you should not keep driving, which is what most of us have done. I've done that too, I've got to own up. Before I did all of this work, I've got to say. But the earlier signs are things like, I'm starting to find it a bit hard to keep my eyes open, vision's becoming a bit blurred. We know, in fact, that they're good early indicators of becoming drowsy and sleepy when you're driving. So if you take action then you're unlikely to get into trouble. If you wait till my head's nearly hit the steering wheel stage, then you've just tossed the coin and it's pot luck. So these are just examples of what happens during 24 hours of period of wake with some different symptom types. But if we then translate that, those early symptoms you'll notice before almost any crash or near-miss crash, but the later ones like the head nodding or dozing off, you will not. And if you actually ask somebody, do you think you're going to fall asleep in the next 15, 20, 30 minutes? We're not that good at predicting it. So less than half of the time are we actually able to know that this is likely to occur in the near future. So again, my kids are sick of me talking to them about this, but these are good things that we can educate people about. So what about what happens in the brain? I'm going to change direction a bit. So what happens as we have this restricted sleep, prolonged driving in the middle of the night? I mentioned that the brain waves slow down. So that's those squiggly lines up the top. And as you come into where that red bar is, you've got somebody getting not quite to sleep, but the brain activity slowing. This is somebody in the middle of the night. They've been awake for 20 hours at 3 a.m, so exactly the circumstance we talked about. And if you look at their eyes, they're kind of just open there. But here they close for, each one is 3 seconds. So they're closed now. They're closed for 3 seconds, 6 seconds, 9 seconds. They're about to go into a proper micro sleep. Closed for 12 seconds, closed for 15 seconds. And now they're awake. And electrical activity has returned and the eyes have opened, but they've had their eyes closed for 15 seconds. It's not hard to say that that's not a good thing when you were driving. Now, for this person on the driving simulator, unbelievably, they did not crash the driving simulator despite having their eyes closed for 15 seconds. Pretty amazing. But these things are common, so they occur in real life, and this is just a simple 24-hour awake experiment on a driving simulator, looking at different durations of how often and for how long people have had their eyes closed. So during the first 14 hours, which is really daytime hours up until 9 o'clock at night, you get some short periods, maybe 1 to 3 seconds where the eyes are closed, but not very often where it's longer than that. But once you go into 17 hours awake, midnight and later, you get this dramatic increase in the number of those short periods, 1 to 3 seconds of the eyes being closed, but increasingly longer episodes right out to more than 15 seconds. So, and this has been shown to occur in people driving in the middle of the night, taking videos of people while they are driving and demonstrating that these events occur. Interestingly, you can demonstrate other things. This is a clever student last year, who looked at our attention. So our attention alters, and I want you to focus these dots on the right. Each dot is where somebody is looking while they are driving over a 2-hour period, and at the top they're awake and alert, and they're scanning side to side, side to side. They look down at the speedo, that's the cluster of dots down the bottom. They look up and they keep scanning. So they're looking at the environment for hazards. The bottom is when they're sleep deprived. So the scanning goes out the window. They start to look all over the place at various other things, pretty lights and billboards and other things, but they're not concentrating. So their visual attention disappears as they become impaired as a result of their sleep deprivation. I'm going to skip through 1 or 2 things, I think. Maybe just talk about this one. So in addition to those sleep effects, how long we drive for does have an impact. So in this particular project, we were looking at shift workers after they were driving home. So a common circumstance. Any shift workers in the audience? Nope. They're at home sleeping because they worked last night. So after night shift, you're often quite sleep restricted. You've been awake for a prolonged period and you've still got some residual body clock effects, and they were driving for 2 hours. And they demonstrated all of these abnormalities I talked about, so changes in their scanning patterns, slow eyelid movements, and this is looking at how long it took before they started crashing. So more than half the participants had crashes, but none of them occurred in about the first half an hour. So the changes in driving performance, you could see them in the first half an hour, but they became much more dramatic after 30 or 45 minutes of driving, and the crashes started to come from then onwards. So if you've got somebody who's at risk of these problems, one of the strategies is to try and limit driving duration. So if you're a shift worker and you've got to drive an hour or so to get home, that's not a good idea. And the last thing I just wanted to touch on was strategies. So what do you do if you're driving along and you start to go, oh, my eyes are finding it hard to keep them open, or maybe you're bad enough to have had a head nodding episode? Well, stop is the first thing. Find somewhere where you can pull over. Lots of roadside stops going up in Australia and hopefully elsewhere around the planet. And the 2 things that you can do at the time really that we know are beneficial are either to have a nap, which is certainly recommended, so put the seat down, put your eye mask on. Professor Summers was saying we need to black out the light, put your earplugs in and put your head down and try and sleep for a while. You do have to be a little careful when you wake up, because if you wake up very groggy, which you can do if you've gone into a deep sleep, then that can be hazardous for driving straight away. So make sure if you wake up that you've given you some time to let your alertness levels come back up towards normal before you get back behind the wheel. And the other thing that you can do, which is reasonable, is caffeine, which also will have benefits for a period of time. But it is important in the background behind that you're doing the other right things, that you've had enough sleep, you've had at least 6 or 7 hours of sleep, particularly if you're going off for a long drive. You try and avoid those periods late at night because they're particularly hazardous. And if you're aware that you have a persistent problem, that you go and get it looked at. So you don't go, oh, I'm dozing off at the traffic lights is okay. I know someone else who's done it. I haven't had a crash yet. But sooner or later you will have one because it's a sign that you're at risk. So they're really some of the takeaway messages. Yeah. So I might throw it open if you have any questions that you would like to ask.